At 6:47 p.m. on April 23, 1993, the temperature in Mobile, Alabama, a Gulf Coast city of 196,278 residents, hung at a sticky 87 degrees Fahrenheit. The air carried the smell of magnolias and salt water, and streetlights were just beginning to flicker on across the historic Garden District. Michelle Beets, 34, head of nursing at Providence Medical Center, one of Mobile's largest hospitals, turned her white 1991 Honda Accord onto Dauphin Street. She'd worked a double shift, her second that week, and exhaustion pressed against her temples like a vice. At 6:52 p.m., a neighbor, Mrs. Carolyn Hayes, saw Michelle's car pull into the narrow driveway of her Victorian cottage on Old Shell Road. Michelle stepped out, navy blue scrubs rumpled, her brown hair tied back in a ponytail that had loosened throughout the day. She carried a leather work bag over one shoulder and a paper grocery sack in her other arm, milk, bread, a rotisserie chicken for dinner. Mrs. Hayes waved from across the street. Michelle waved back, smiled briefly, then turned toward her front porch. That wave, captured by no camera but seared into Mrs. Hayes's memory, would become the last confirmed sighting of Michelle Beets alive. By 9:30 p.m., Michelle's fiancé, Dr. Robert Chen, an internist at the same hospital, would arrive at the cottage to find the front door ajar, lights off inside, and Michelle's body on the porch steps. By midnight, Old Shell Road would be cordoned off with yellow police tape trembling in the Gulf breeze, and detectives would be asking a question that would haunt Mobile for nearly 2 decades. What happened in the 3 hours between Michelle's smile and the darkness that swallowed her? Michelle Beets had grown up in Montgomery, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a postal worker. She'd put herself through nursing school at the University of Alabama, graduated top of her class in 1981, and spent the next 12 years building a reputation as one of the most dedicated nurses in southern Alabama. By 1993, she'd risen to head of nursing at Providence Medical Center, overseeing a staff of 187 nurses across 6 floors. Colleagues described her as demanding but fair, someone who stayed late to help struggling nurses master new procedures, who remembered birthdays and brought homemade cookies to night shift workers. She loved jazz music, collected antique medical instruments, and volunteered at a free clinic in downtown Mobile every other Saturday. She and Robert had met 3 years earlier during a code blue emergency. Their hands had worked in perfect synchronization to revive a cardiac arrest patient, and they'd been inseparable since. They'd set a wedding date for October 16, 1993. Michelle had already picked out her dress, a simple ivory gown hanging in her bedroom closet. On April 23rd, she'd worked from 6 a.m. to 6:30 p.m., covering for a nurse who'd called in sick. Her last conversation at the hospital had been with a surgical nurse named Jennifer, who'd asked about honeymoon plans. Michelle had laughed, said they were thinking about New Orleans, somewhere with good food and live music. She'd left through the employee exit at 6:34 p.m., waving to the security guard, Marcus, who later told police Michelle had seemed tired but happy, talking about finally getting a night off. At 6:40 p.m., Michelle stopped at a Winn-Dixie grocery store on Airport Boulevard. Security footage, grainy, black and white, time-stamped in the corner, showed her walking down the dairy aisle, selecting a gallon of milk, moving to the bakery section for a loaf of wheat bread, then to the deli counter where she purchased the rotisserie chicken. She paid with a credit card at 6:44 p.m. Register 3, clerk named Donna. Donna would later tell investigators that Michelle had seemed normal, maybe a little distracted, but nothing unusual. Michelle had asked if they were still open on Saturdays. Donna said yes until 10 p.m., and Michelle had nodded, said something about needing to pick up more groceries that weekend. At 6:46 p.m., Michelle walked out the automatic doors, the plastic grocery bag swinging from her hand. The parking lot surveillance captured her unlocking the Honda, placing the bag on the passenger seat, starting the engine. At 6:47 p.m., she pulled out onto Airport Boulevard, heading east toward Old Shell Road. The drive should have taken 11 minutes. Cell phone records, Michelle had one of the early Motorola bag phones installed in her car, showed no calls made or received during this window. At 6:52 p.m., Mrs. Hayes saw her arrive home. At 6:53 p.m., According to later forensic reconstruction, Michelle walked up the 7 wooden steps to her front porch, grocery bag in one hand, work bag over her shoulder, keys in her other hand. She reached the porch. The motion sensor light that usually illuminated the entrance didn't turn on. Michelle likely noticed this. She'd complained to Robert just 2 days earlier that the bulb needed replacing. She took another step forward. And then, in the gathering dusk, someone moved from the shadows beside the porch swing. By 9:30 p.m., when Robert pulled into the driveway, the streetlights cast long shadows across the Victorian cottage. He noticed immediately that the house was dark. Every window black, no porch light, no lamp glowing through the lace curtains Michelle loved. His stomach tightened. Michelle always left lights on. She hated coming home to darkness. Robert parked behind Michelle's Honda, which sat in its usual spot, driver's door closed, no visible damage. He walked toward the porch, calling Michelle's name. No answer. The cicadas thrummed in the magnolia trees. The smell of wisteria hung heavy in the humid air. As Robert climbed the first porch step, his shoe caught on something. He looked down. In the dim spill of streetlight, he saw Michelle's work bag, contents scattered, stethoscope, patient charts, a half-eaten granola bar. 2 steps higher, the grocery bag lay on its side, milk carton split open, white liquid pooling in the grooves between boards, bread loaf crushed, rotisserie chicken container cracked. And at the top of the steps, crumpled against the front door, was Michelle. Robert screamed her name, ran up the steps, dropped to his knees. Michelle lay on her right side, facing the door, her hands still clutching her keys. Her scrubs were torn and darkened with blood. Her eyes were open, staring at nothing. Robert pressed his fingers to her neck. No pulse, skin already cooling in the Alabama heat. He stumbled backward, nearly fell down the steps, ran to Mrs. Hayes's house across the street, pounded on the door. Mrs. Hayes opened it, saw Robert's face, white, eyes wild, and immediately called 911. The call came in at 9:33 p.m. Mobile Police Department dispatch sent units to 1847, Old Shell Road, possible homicide, female victim, no suspect on scene. The first patrol car arrived at 9:39 p.m. Officers James Whitmore and Sandra Lee. They approached the porch with flashlights cutting through the darkness, confirmed Michelle was deceased, secured the scene, called for homicide detectives and crime scene investigators. By 10:15 p.m., the street was flooded with emergency vehicles, patrol cars, an ambulance that sat idle with lights off, the medical examiner's van, unmarked detective sedans. Detective Lieutenant Marcus Sullivan, 46, head of Mobile's homicide unit, arrived at 10:22 p.m. Sullivan was a 22-year veteran, tall and lean with graying hair and a measured way of speaking that put witnesses at ease. He'd worked 34 homicides in his career, solving all but 3. He stepped out of his Crown Victoria, surveyed the scene. Yellow tape encircling the property. Neighbors gathered on sidewalks whispering behind cupped hands, portable floodlights being set up to illuminate the porch. Sullivan walked slowly up the driveway, noting Michelle's Honda undisturbed. No broken windows, no signs of forced entry into the vehicle. He climbed the porch steps carefully, stepping around evidence markers already placed by crime scene technicians. Marker 1 at Michelle's work bag, Marker 2 at the spilled groceries, Marker 3 at Michelle's body. The front door was closed but unlocked. Sullivan pulled on latex gloves, turned the knob, pushed the door open. Inside, the house was pitch black. He flipped the light switch by the door. Nothing. He tried another switch. Nothing. Sullivan pulled out his flashlight, swept the beam across the living room. Furniture undisturbed, no signs of struggle, everything in its place. He walked through the house. Dining room, kitchen, bedroom, bathroom. All untouched, no drawers pulled open, no cabinets ransacked. He returned to the porch where Dr. Patricia Nolan, the medical examiner, was conducting her preliminary examination of Michelle's body. Dr. Nolan, 52, had been Mobile County's chief medical examiner for 9 years. She knelt beside Michelle, speaking observations into a handheld tape recorder. Female victim, appears early to mid-30s, wearing medical scrubs with identification badge reading Michelle Beets, RN, head of nursing, Providence Medical Center. Multiple stab wounds visible to the chest and abdomen, approximately, she counted carefully. 7 distinct wounds, penetrating through clothing. Defensive wounds apparent on both hands and forearms. Rigor mortis not yet fully established, liver temperature. She inserted a thermometer, 92.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Ambient temperature 83 degrees. Time of death estimated between 7 o'clock and 8 p.m. Pending autopsy confirmation. Dr. Nolan looked up at Sullivan. This wasn't random, Marcus. The wounds are deep, delivered with force. The pattern suggests rage or personal motivation. And look at her hands. She fought hard. Sullivan nodded, jaw tight. He'd seen enough crime scenes to know the difference between a robbery gone wrong and a planned killing. This had the markers of premeditation written all over it. Crime scene investigator David Park, 38, a forensic specialist with the Mobile Police Department, had been documenting the scene for 40 minutes. He photographed Michelle's body from 12 different angles, each flash of his camera casting harsh white light across the porch, freezing the tragedy in stark detail. He photographed the scattered groceries, the work bag, the blood spatter on the front door and porch floorboards. Then Park turned his attention to the technical investigation. He pulled out an ultraviolet light, swept it across the porch railing, and immediately found partial bloody handprints. Not Michelle's size, larger, likely male. He marked them with evidence flags, photographed them, then used a specialized lifting technique to transfer the prints onto acetate sheets labeled Evidence A1 Beets case. Park moved to the front door, examined the lock mechanism under magnification, found no scratches or damage, no forced entry. He walked around the exterior of the house, checking windows, all locked from inside. At the side of the house, near the electrical meter, Park found something that made his stomach drop. The main power line running from the street pole to the house's breaker box had been cut. Cleanly severed with a sharp tool, the copper wire ends bright and shiny under his flashlight. 20 feet away, the phone line junction box mounted on the house's exterior wall had been pried open, wires inside yanked loose. Park documented everything with photographs, measurements, sketches. He returned to Sullivan, who was interviewing Robert Chen on the front lawn. "Lieutenant, you need to see this," Park said quietly. Sullivan followed him to the side of the house. Park pointed his flashlight at the severed power line. This wasn't opportunistic. Whoever did this came prepared. They cut the power before she got home, disabled the phone line, then waited for her. Sullivan stared at the cut wires, his expression hardening. So this wasn't a robbery. This was an execution. By 11:45 p.m., the medical examiner's team had removed Michelle's body, loading the gurney into the van with respectful efficiency. Robert Chen sat in the back of an ambulance, shock blanket around his shoulders, giving his statement to Detective Angela Martinez, Sullivan's partner. Martinez, 39, a 12-year veteran with a reputation for patience and thoroughness, took detailed notes as Robert described his relationship with Michelle, their plans to marry, his arrival at the house. "Did Michelle mention anyone threatening her?" Martinez asked. "Anyone from work, from her personal life, anyone at all who might have wanted to hurt her?" Robert shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "No, everyone loved Michelle. She was the kindest person I knew." Martinez paused, choosing her words carefully. Sometimes in positions of authority, people make difficult decisions. Did Michelle ever have to fire someone? Reprimand someone? Any conflicts at the hospital? Robert's expression shifted, a flicker of recollection. There was, about 6 weeks ago, maybe 2 months, Michelle had to let someone go. A nurse or maybe an orderly, I don't remember exactly. She was upset about it. Said the person had been inappropriate with female staff, made comments, created uncomfortable situations. Hospital HR had been documenting issues for months. Michelle finally had to terminate him. Martinez leaned forward. "Do you remember his name?" Robert closed his eyes, trying to recall. "Walter something. I never met him, but Michelle mentioned it a few times. She said he'd taken it badly, made some comment about her regretting it. She was shaken up for a few days, but then it seemed to pass. Martinez wrote quickly. Walter. Do you remember a last name, where he worked in the hospital, anything else? Robert shook his head. I'm sorry, I can't think straight right now. At 12:30 a.m. on April 24th, Detective Sullivan gathered his team in the Mobile Police Department's homicide office on Government Street. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, coffee brewed in a machine in the corner, and the city beyond the windows was quiet except for occasional traffic. Sullivan stood at a whiteboard, marker in hand, and wrote, Michelle Beets, April 23, 1993. Underneath, he began listing what they knew. Victim, Michelle Beets, age 34, head of nursing at Providence Medical Center. Time of death, estimated 7 to 8 p.m. Location, front porch of her home, 1847 Old Shell Road. Cause of death, multiple stab wounds, pending autopsy confirmation. Evidence of premeditation, power lines cut, phone lines disabled. No forced entry, no robbery. Purse found inside house untouched. Wedding ring still on victim's finger. Wallet with cash and credit cards in her work bag. Defensive wounds indicate struggle. Partial handprints recovered from porch railing. He turned to face the room. Martinez, Park, 2 other detectives, and a patrol sergeant. This was personal. The killer knew her routine, knew when she'd be home, prepared the scene. Our first priority is victimology. Who had reason to want Michelle Beets dead? The fiancé mentioned a recent termination at the hospital, someone named Walter. Martinez, first thing tomorrow, you and I visit Providence Medical Center, talk to HR, get employee records. Park, I need full forensic workup, those handprints, any DNA from the struggle, soil samples from around the house. Check for footprints, tire tracks, anything the killer might have left behind. Everyone else, start canvassing the neighborhood tomorrow morning. Someone might have seen a vehicle, a person on foot, something out of place. The room nodded in unison. Sullivan capped the marker. Michelle Beets left work at 6:34 p.m., arrived home at 6:52 p.m., and was dead within an hour. We have a narrow window and a deliberate crime. Let's find this Walter and see where it leads. At 8:15 a.m. on April 24th, Sullivan and Martinez walked into Providence Medical Center, a sprawling 6-story brick building on Spring Hill Avenue. The lobby smelled of disinfectant and floor wax, nurses and doctors moving through corridors with purposeful efficiency. At the HR office on the 2nd floor, they met with Diane Fletcher, 51, the hospital's director of human resources. Fletcher's eyes were red-rimmed. She'd heard about Michelle's death on the morning news and had been crying in her office since arriving at work. She was irreplaceable, Fletcher said quietly, gesturing for the detectives to sit. She cared about every nurse, every patient, every detail. I still can't believe she's gone. Sullivan leaned forward, voice gentle but direct. Ms. Fletcher, we understand Michelle recently terminated an employee, someone named Walter. We need everything you have on him. Full name, position, reason for termination, any incidents or complaints. Fletcher nodded, turned to her computer, typed quickly. After a moment, she pulled up a file, printed several pages. Walter Gaines, age 29. He was hired 2 years ago as a nursing assistant in the surgical unit. Initially good performance reviews, but starting about a year ago, we began receiving complaints. Female nurses reported he made inappropriate comments, stood too close, found excuses to touch their shoulders or hands. One nurse said he followed her to her car after a shift. Michelle documented everything, formal warnings in October 1992, another in January 1993. By March, it was clear Walter wasn't going to change his behavior. Michelle made the decision to terminate him on March 8, 1993. Sullivan took the printouts, scanned them. Walter Gaines's employee photo showed a thin man with close-cropped dark hair, angular features, and eyes that seemed to look through the camera rather than at it. How did he react to the termination? Fletcher's expression darkened. He was furious. Michelle had 2 security guards present during the meeting, standard protocol for terminations involving behavioral issues. Walter sat there silently while Michelle explained the decision. But when she finished, he stood up, leaned across the desk, and said, "You're going to regret this." Those exact words. Then he walked out. Martinez wrote quickly. Did he make any other threats? Return to the hospital. Fletcher nodded. He came back twice. Once 3 days after termination, trying to enter through the employee entrance. Security escorted him off the property. Then again on March 22nd, a nurse saw him in the parking lot, just sitting in his car watching the building. We called police, filed a trespassing report. Sullivan looked up. Do you have an address for Walter Gaines? Fletcher handed him another sheet. Last known address is an apartment on Davenport Street, Unit 7B. But I don't know if he still lives there. At 10:40 a.m., Sullivan and Martinez pulled up outside a weathered 2-story apartment complex on Davenport Street in West Mobile, a neighborhood of faded brick buildings and chain-link fences. The morning heat was already building, 91 degrees, humidity thick enough to swim through. They climbed the exterior stairs to the 2nd floor, knocked on the door of apartment 7B. No answer. Sullivan knocked again, harder. After a moment, footsteps inside, and the door opened 6 inches, held by a security chain. A woman peered through the gap, mid-20s, blonde hair pulled back, wearing a faded t-shirt and jeans, eyes wary. "Can I help you?" she asked. Sullivan held up his badge. "Mobile Police Department. We're looking for Walter Gaines. Does he live here?" The woman's expression shifted, fear flickering across her face. "Walter's my husband. What's this about?" Sullivan kept his voice calm. "We need to speak with him regarding an ongoing investigation. Is he home?" She shook her head. "He left early this morning, around 6 a.m. Said he had errands to run." Martinez spoke up. "Ma'am, what's your name?" "Carla. Carla Gaines." "Mrs. Gaines, we need to ask you some questions. May we come in?" Carla hesitated, then unhooked the chain, opened the door. The apartment was small, living room with a sagging couch, kitchenette with dishes piled in the sink, narrow hallway leading to a bedroom. The air inside was stale, curtains drawn. Carla gestured to the couch. Sullivan and Martinez sat. Carla remained standing, arms crossed, defensive. "What's Walter supposed to have done?" Sullivan pulled out his notebook. "Mrs. Gaines, are you aware your husband was terminated from Providence Medical Center in March?" She nodded slowly. "He told me, said it was unfair, that the head nurse had it out for him." "The head nurse was Michelle Beets," Martinez said. "She was murdered last night." The color drained from Carla's face. She sank into a chair across from the detectives, her hands trembling. "Murdered? Oh my God." Sullivan watched her carefully. "Where was Walter last night? Around 7 p.m.? Carla's voice came out barely above a whisper. He said he was out looking for work. He left around 5:30 p.m. Didn't come back until almost 11 p.m. "Did he say where he went?" She shook her head. "Just driving around, filling out applications. That's what he's been doing since he got fired." Martinez leaned forward. "Mrs. Gaines, did Walter ever talk about Michelle Beets? About being angry, wanting revenge?" Carla's eyes filled with tears. "He was angry, yeah. He'd complain about her, say she ruined his career, that no hospital would hire him after being fired. But that's just... people say things when they're upset. It doesn't mean..." She trailed off. Sullivan stood, walked to the window, pulled back the curtain slightly, looked down at the parking lot. "What kind of vehicle does Walter drive?" Carla wiped her eyes. "A blue Ford Ranger, 1989. Sullivan turned. "And you said he was in the military?" She nodded. "Army. He served 6 years, got out in 1991. He was stationed at Fort Benning, trained in combat medicine, but after he left, he couldn't get into a nursing program, so he did nursing assistant work instead." Martinez made notes. "Combat training. What did that involve?" Carla's voice was quiet. He doesn't talk about it much, but I know he was trained in hand-to-hand combat, weapons, survival tactics. He keeps his army gear in the closet, knives, a K-bar combat knife he's really proud of. The room went silent. Sullivan exchanged a glance with Martinez. Mrs. Gaines, we're going to need to speak with Walter as soon as possible. When he comes home, have him call this number immediately. He handed her a card. And we'll need consent to search this apartment, or we can obtain a warrant. Your choice. Carla stared at the card, her hands shaking. You think Walter killed that nurse? It wasn't a question. Sullivan's voice was firm but not unkind. We're investigating all leads. Right now, we need to talk to your husband. Carla stood, walked to the bedroom, returned with a key. Search whatever you want. I need to know the truth. For the next 2 hours, Sullivan, Martinez, and forensic investigator Park methodically processed apartment 7B. They found Walter's army footlocker in the bedroom closet, several combat knives, including a K-bar with a 7-inch blade, clean but showing signs of recent sharpening based on fresh metallic residue along the edge. Park photographed each item, bagged the knives for testing. In the nightstand drawer, they found a spiral notebook filled with handwritten entries, a disturbing journal of sorts. Martinez read aloud to Sullivan. March 10th. She thinks she can destroy me and walk away. Michelle Beets doesn't know who she's dealing with. March 15th. Drove past her house today, 1847 Old Shell Road, Victorian cottage, blue trim, magnolia tree in front yard. She usually gets home around 7 p.m. March 20th. Practiced with K-bar tonight, muscle memory coming back. Army training never leaves you. Martinez flipped pages. March 28th, she'll pay for what she did. They all will. Sullivan's jaw clenched. That's premeditation. Keep reading. Martinez continued. April 15th. Watched her leave work tonight. Followed her home. Kept 3 cars back so she wouldn't notice. She stopped at the grocery store, then went straight home. Same routine every time. April 20th. Cutting the power will be easy. Junction box on the side of the house. No lock, just pry it open. Phone line is above it. 1 snip. Martinez looked up. This is a playbook. He planned every detail. Sullivan nodded grimly. Bag that notebook. And find his boots. We need to match prints from the scene. Park was already in the closet, pulling out a pair of Army-issue combat boots, size 11. He photographed the treads, noting dried mud caked in the grooves. I'll compare these to soil samples from the Beets house, Park said. If he was there, we'll know. At 2:15 p.m., Sullivan and Martinez returned to the police department. Sullivan immediately put out an APB for Walter Gaines, blue 1989 Ford Ranger. License plate number pulled from DMV records. Suspect considered armed and dangerous. Patrol units across Mobile were notified. At 3:30 p.m., Detective Sullivan received a call from a patrol officer. Lieutenant, we've located the vehicle. Parked outside a Motel 6 on Government Boulevard. No sign of the driver yet, but we have the room under surveillance. Sullivan grabbed his jacket. Don't approach. Martinez and I are on our way. If he shows up, observe only. They arrived at the Motel 6 at 3:48 p.m. The blue Ford Ranger sat in the parking lot, sun beating down on its faded paint. 2 patrol units were positioned at opposite corners of the lot, officers watching. Sullivan approached the motel office, showed his badge to the clerk, a middle-aged woman with orange lipstick. We're looking for a guest named Walter Gaines. Is he registered here? The woman checked her computer. Room 114. Checked in yesterday afternoon. Sullivan nodded. Thank you. Stay inside. He radioed for backup, and within minutes, 4 more units arrived, along with a tactical team. At 4:20 p.m., they approached room 114, weapons drawn. Sullivan knocked. Walter Gaines, this is Mobile Police. Open the door. Silence. Sullivan knocked again. Mr. Gaines, we have the room surrounded. Come out with your hands up. After a long moment, the door opened slowly. Walter Gaines stood in the doorway, thin, early 30s, wearing jeans and a white t-shirt, barefoot, expression blank. He raised his hands without being told. "I figured you'd come," he said quietly. Officers moved in, cuffed him, patted him down. Sullivan read him his Miranda rights as they walked him to the patrol car. Walter said nothing, staring straight ahead as they placed him in the back seat. At mobile police headquarters, Walter Gaines was processed. Fingerprints, photographs, DNA swab. At 6:15 p.m., Sullivan and Martinez sat across from him in interview room 2, a windowless box with gray walls and a metal table bolted to the floor. Walter's hands were cuffed to a ring on the table. He looked tired, eyes red-rimmed, shoulders slumped. Sullivan started the tape recorder. "This is Detective Lieutenant Marcus Sullivan, interviewing Walter Gaines on April 24, 1993, at 6:16 p.m. Mr. Gaines, you've been read your rights. Do you understand them?" Walter nodded. "Yes. You have the right to an attorney. Do you wish to have one present?" Walter shook his head. "No." Sullivan opened a folder, pulled out Michelle's employee photo, placed it in front of Walter. "Do you recognize this woman?" Walter stared at the photo for a long time. "Michelle Beets, my former supervisor. Where were you yesterday evening?" "April 23rd. Between 6 o'clock and 9 p.m.? Walter's voice was flat. "Driving around. Looking for work." "Where specifically?" "Different places. I don't remember." Martinez leaned forward. "Walter, we searched your apartment. We found your notebooks, the ones where you wrote about Michelle, about watching her house, about planning. We found your knives. We know you were fired and you blamed her." Walter said nothing. Sullivan pulled out another photo, crime scene image of Michelle's body on the porch. "Michelle Beets was murdered last night on her front porch, stabbed 7 times. The power lines to her house were cut beforehand. The phone lines disabled. This wasn't random. This was planned. Your notebooks describe exactly how to do it." Walter's eyes finally showed emotion, a flicker of something, maybe fear, maybe regret. His voice came out as a whisper. "I didn't mean for it to go that far." The room went silent. Sullivan kept his expression neutral. "Tell us what happened, Walter." Walter closed his eyes. "She destroyed my life. I couldn't get another job, couldn't pay rent. My wife started looking at me like I was a failure. I just wanted her to feel what I felt. I wanted her to be scared, to know what it's like to lose everything." "So you went to her house," Martinez said. Walter nodded slowly. "I cut the power, cut the phone line, just like I wrote. I didn't think she'd fight so hard. She had pepper spray in her bag. Sprayed me in the face. I couldn't see. He trailed off. Sullivan's voice was hard. "You stabbed her. 7 times. Walter's head dropped. "I didn't go there to kill her. I wanted her to apologize, to admit she was wrong. But she screamed, she fought, and I lost control." The confession was recorded, transcribed, signed. Walter Gaines was formally charged with first-degree murder, along with additional charges of stalking, trespassing, and criminal tampering. The evidence was overwhelming. His journal documenting surveillance and planning, his combat knives matching the wound patterns, his own admission. Over the following weeks, forensic results came back confirming what detectives already knew. The partial handprints on Michelle's porch railing matched Walter's right hand. Soil samples from his army boots matched the dirt composition of Michelle's yard. Fibers from his t-shirt were found under Michelle's fingernails. She'd fought hard, scratched him during the struggle. The timeline was reconstructed with precision. Walter had arrived at Michelle's house at approximately 6:30 p.m., parked 3 blocks away, walked through backyards to approach from behind, cut the power and phone lines at 6:45 p.m., then positioned himself beside the porch swing, hidden by shadows and an overgrown wisteria vine. When Michelle arrived at 6:52 p.m., he waited until she reached the top of the porch steps, then confronted her. The struggle lasted approximately 3 minutes based on blood spatter analysis. Michelle fought with everything she had, using her keys as a weapon, scratching his face and arms, spraying pepper spray that ultimately failed to stop him. Walter fled on foot back to his truck, drove to the Motel 6, changed clothes, cleaned his wounds, and tried to sleep. But sleep didn't come. Guilt and panic consumed him, and by morning, he knew it was only a matter of time before police connected him to the crime. But there was more to this story, details that emerged in the weeks following Walter's arrest. On May 3, 1993, Detective Sullivan received a phone call that would crack the case wide open. It was Carla Gaines. Her voice was shaking, barely audible. "Detective Sullivan, I need to tell you something. I should have said it the day you came to the apartment, but I was scared. I need to tell you now." Sullivan put her on speakerphone, gestured for Martinez to listen. "Go ahead, Mrs. Gaines. Whatever you tell us will help." Carla took a shuddering breath. "Walter came home that night, April 23rd, around 10:45 p.m. I was already in bed, pretending to be asleep. He went straight to the bathroom, and I heard the shower running for almost an hour. When he finally came to bed, I turned over, asked him where he'd been. He didn't answer at first. Then he said, 'I did something I can't take back.' I asked what he meant, and he just stared at the ceiling. Then he said, 'Michelle Beets won't be a problem anymore.'" Sullivan leaned toward the speaker. "Did he explain what he meant?" Carla's voice broke. "I didn't want to believe it. But the next morning, I saw the news, Michelle's murder, and I knew. I confronted Walter, demanded the truth. He told me everything. How he'd been watching her for weeks. How he'd planned it down to the last detail. He said he'd practiced knife techniques in the backyard at night, shadow stabbing the air, rehearsing the motions. He said he'd driven past her house 20 times, memorizing her routine, timing her arrival from work. He said on the day it happened, he parked 3 blocks away, walked through neighbors' yards wearing dark clothes and gloves. He cut the power at exactly 6:45 p.m. because he knew she'd arrive within 10 minutes. When she came up the steps, he stepped out, and she turned, saw him. He said she knew immediately what was about to happen. He saw it in her eyes. She screamed, tried to run back down the steps, but he grabbed her arm, pulled her back. She fought so hard, scratched his face, sprayed something in his eyes, but he was trained for combat, and she wasn't strong enough. He said after the first stab, something inside him snapped, and he just kept going until she stopped moving. The room was silent except for Carla's quiet sobbing on the phone. Martinez closed her eyes, jaw clenched. Sullivan's voice was steady. "Mrs. Gaines, why didn't you tell us this immediately?" Carla's answer was raw. "Because he's my husband. Because I was terrified. Because I didn't want to believe the man I married was capable of this. But I can't live with it anymore. Every night, I see Michelle's face on the news, her mother crying, her fiancé collapsing at the funeral. I have to tell the truth." Carla's testimony became a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. But there was another witness who came forward, someone unexpected. On May 10th, a man named Derek Collins, a freelance journalist for the Mobile Press Register, contacted Detective Sullivan. Collins had been covering crime stories in Mobile for 8 years, and he had a reputation for getting sources to talk. "Detective, I interviewed Walter Gaines 2 days after his arrest," Collins said. "It was off the record at the county jail. He wanted to talk, said he needed someone to understand why he did it. I took notes, but I didn't publish anything because I wasn't sure if it would compromise the investigation. Now that there's been an arrest and charges filed, I think you should hear what he told me." Sullivan met Collins at a coffee shop on Dauphin Street. Collins pulled out a leather notebook, flipped to pages dated April 26, 1993. "Walter was calm when we talked, almost detached. He said Michelle Beets represented everything wrong with authority, people who make decisions that destroy lives without understanding consequences. He said after he was fired, he applied to 17 different hospitals and clinics in Alabama, and every time they'd call Providence for a reference, and every time they'd decline to hire him based on what Michelle had written in his termination file. He said she didn't just fire him, she made sure he could never work in healthcare again. That's when he decided she needed to pay." Collins turned a page. "He told me he'd been following her for 6 weeks. He learned her schedule, her habits, the route she took home, where she stopped for groceries. He said on April 15th, he sat in his truck outside Providence Medical Center for 3 hours, watching her through binoculars. He said she smiled a lot, laughed with coworkers, looked happy. That made him angrier. She'd ruined his life and didn't even care. So he started planning in detail. He bought wire cutters at a hardware store on Airport Boulevard, paid cash. He wore gloves when he cut the power and phone lines so he wouldn't leave fingerprints. He brought his K-bar knife, the one he'd carried in the army, the one he trusted. He said when Michelle came up the porch steps, he didn't say anything at first, just stepped out so she'd see him. She recognized him immediately, said his name, Walter, and her voice was confused, not scared yet. He said, "You remember me?" She backed up, said, "Walter, you can't be here. I'm calling the police." But the phone was dead. He'd made sure of that. That's when she realized. She screamed, turned to run, and he grabbed her. Collins paused, looked up at Sullivan. He said killing her wasn't part of the plan. He wanted to scare her, to make her beg, to hear her apologize. But when she fought back, when she scratched his face and sprayed him, something in him broke. He said it was like watching himself from outside his body. He saw his hands stabbing, saw the blood, heard her choking, but he couldn't stop. When it was over, she was lying on the porch, and he was standing there with the knife, and he knew his life was over too. The trial of Walter Gaines began on September 13, 1993, in Mobile County Circuit Court. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Thomas Reed, 52, built a meticulous case. They presented Carla Gaines's testimony, Derek Collins's interview notes, the forensic evidence, the journal entries, the surveillance timeline. They showed the jury crime scene photos, autopsy reports, Michelle's torn scrubs. They brought in Michelle's colleagues from Providence Medical Center, who testified to her kindness, her dedication, her fear after firing Walter. They called Robert Chen to the stand, and he broke down describing finding Michelle's body, the wedding that would never happen, the future stolen. The defense, led by public defender Alan Morris, argued that Walter had been suffering from PTSD after his military service, that he hadn't intended to kill Michelle, that it was a moment of uncontrollable rage brought on by unemployment and desperation. The jury didn't buy it. On October 8, 1993, after 4 hours of deliberation, they returned a verdict. Guilty on all counts. First-degree murder. Premeditated. The courtroom erupted. Michelle's family sobbed. Robert Chen collapsed into his seat. Walter Gaines stared at the table, expressionless. At sentencing 2 weeks later, Judge Harold Mitchell, a 28-year veteran of the bench, looked at Walter with undisguised contempt. "Mr. Gaines, you took the life of a woman who dedicated hers to helping others. You stalked her, planned her murder, and carried it out with military precision. You showed no mercy, and this court will show you none. I sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole." Walter was led away in handcuffs. He never looked back at his wife, who sat in the gallery crying quietly. Carla filed for divorce 3 months later. Walter Gaines was incarcerated at Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama, a maximum security prison 60 miles north of Mobile. For the first 2 years, he kept to himself, worked in the prison laundry, avoided trouble. But in 1995, another inmate, serving time for armed robbery, later told guards that Walter had confessed to him during a late-night conversation in the cell block. The inmate, whose name was Marcus Hill, said Walter had described the murder in chilling detail, how he'd felt powerful holding the knife, how Michelle's fear had been satisfying at first, then horrifying when he realized what he'd done. Hill reported this to prison officials, and the confession was documented in Walter's file. In 1998, Walter was transferred to St. Clair Correctional Facility in Springville, Alabama, after an altercation with another inmate. He spent the next several years in relative anonymity, a forgotten man serving a life sentence for a crime that had faded from public memory. On November 14, 2006, Walter Gaines died in prison. The cause of death was listed as complications from pneumonia. He was 42 years old. No family members claimed his body. He was buried in a prison cemetery, a small marker with his name and inmate number the only indication anyone had been there. Michelle Beets' death left a permanent scar on Mobile's medical community. Providence Medical Center, where she dedicated 12 years of her life, established the Michelle Beets Memorial Award in her honor. Every year, the award is given to a nurse who exemplifies compassion, dedication, and leadership in patient care. The first recipient, in 1994, was Jennifer, the surgical nurse who'd been Michelle's close friend and who had spoken with her about honeymoon plans hours before her death. Jennifer accepted the award in tears, saying, "Michelle believed nursing was more than a job. It was a calling. She treated every patient like family, and she treated every nurse on her staff like they mattered. That's her legacy, and it's one we should all strive to live up to." In 1995, Alabama passed new workplace safety legislation, partially inspired by Michelle's case, requiring hospitals to conduct threat assessments for terminated employees and providing resources for workers who felt unsafe after workplace conflicts. The law, known as the Healthcare Worker Safety Act, mandated security escorts for employees leaving the building, panic buttons in administrative offices, and mandatory reporting of threats or stalking behavior. Providence Medical Center installed a state-of-the-art security system with cameras covering parking lots and entrances, and they hired additional security staff to patrol the grounds during evening shifts. Michelle's mother, Michelle Beets, became an advocate for victims' rights, speaking at conferences and legislative hearings about the need for stronger stalking laws and better protections for workers dealing with hostile former colleagues. In a 1997 interview with the Mobile Press Register, Patricia said, "My daughter's death was preventable. If there had been better systems in place, if someone had taken Walter's threats seriously, Michelle might still be alive. I don't want another family to go through what we've been through." Patricia died in 2011, but her advocacy work continued through a foundation she established, the Michelle Beets Foundation, which provides legal assistance and counseling services to victims of stalking and workplace violence. Robert Chen never remarried. He continued working as an internist at Providence Medical Center until his retirement in 2018, 25 years after Michelle's death. Colleagues said he kept a photo of Michelle on his desk, and every year on April 23rd, he took the day off. In a rare interview in 2013, on the 20th anniversary of Michelle's murder, Robert spoke to a local TV station. "Michelle was the love of my life," he said quietly. "We had plans, marriage, children, growing old together. All of that was taken away in 3 minutes of violence. People ask me if I found closure, if the trial and Walter's conviction helped me heal. The truth is, there's no such thing as closure when you lose someone like Michelle. You just learn to live with a permanent hole in your heart. But I've tried to honor her memory by continuing the work she loved, caring for patients, treating everyone with dignity and compassion. That's what Michelle would have wanted." Robert donated to the Michelle Beets Memorial Award Fund every year, and he attended the annual ceremony, watching as new generations of nurses received recognition for embodying the values Michelle had lived by. Detective Marcus Sullivan retired from the Mobile Police Department in 2001 after 30 years of service. He'd solved 49 homicides in his career, including Michelle Beets's case, which he always said was one of the most tragic because it was so preventable. In his retirement speech, Sullivan spoke about the cases that haunted him. "You never forget the victims," he said. "Their faces stay with you. Their families' grief stays with you." Michelle Beets was a good person who dedicated her life to helping others, and she was killed by someone who couldn't handle being held accountable for his own behavior. That's the hardest part of this job, knowing that sometimes the evil isn't random, isn't a stranger in the dark. Sometimes it's someone who was right there all along, someone who had access and opportunity and chose violence. But I'm grateful we were able to get justice for Michelle. Her killer is in prison, and he'll never hurt anyone else. Sullivan died in 2009 at age 72, and his obituary listed the Michelle Beets case as one of his most significant investigations. Detective Angela Martinez, his partner, continued working homicides until her retirement in 2010. She later became an instructor at the Alabama Criminal Justice Training Center, teaching new detectives about victimology and the importance of thorough investigations. She often used Michelle's case as an example in her classes, showing how premeditation can be proven through careful documentation and forensic evidence. Crime scene investigator David Park, who had processed Michelle's porch and collected the crucial forensic evidence, went on to become the director of Mobile's crime lab. In a 2015 interview for a forensic science journal, Park reflected on the Beets case. In 1993, forensic technology wasn't what it is today. We didn't have DNA databases, advanced fingerprint analysis software, or digital forensics. But we had good old-fashioned detective work, careful documentation, meticulous evidence collection, and persistence. The handprints on Michelle's porch railing were the key. If we hadn't found those, if we hadn't matched them to Walter Gaines, the case might have gone cold. It's a reminder that every piece of evidence matters, no matter how small. You can't cut corners, you can't rush. You have to treat every crime scene like it's the most important case you'll ever work on. Because for the victim and their family, it is. Park retired in 2018, but he remained active in the forensic science community, mentoring young investigators and emphasizing the importance of integrity and thoroughness in evidence collection. Carla Gaines, Walter's wife, disappeared from public view after their divorce in 1994. She moved out of Mobile, and no records indicate where she went. In the trial, she had testified against Walter, and her testimony had been devastating, describing his confession, his planning, his lack of remorse in the immediate aftermath. Some speculated she went to another state, changed her name, tried to start over. In a brief statement to reporters after the trial, Carla said, "I loved the man I married, but I don't know who he became. What he did to Michelle Beets was unforgivable. I hope her family can find peace, and I hope I can find a way to live with the knowledge that I was married to a killer." There were no further public statements from Carla, and she faded into anonymity, another casualty of Walter's violence in a different way, her life irrevocably altered by his choices. The neighborhood where Michelle had lived, Old Shell Road, remained quiet and tree-lined. The Victorian cottage where she died eventually sold in 1996. The new owners renovated it, repainted the trim, replaced the porch boards where Michelle's blood had soaked into the wood. They knew the history, everyone in Mobile knew the history, but they loved the house's character, its magnolia tree, its proximity to downtown. Over the years, the story became part of local lore, told in hushed tones, a reminder that violence can happen anywhere, to anyone. Mrs. Carolyn Hayes, the neighbor who'd waved to Michelle that final evening, moved to a retirement community in 2001. Before she left, she planted a memorial garden in her front yard, white daisies and purple irises, Michelle's favorite flowers. A small plaque read, "In memory of Michelle Beets, 1959 to 1993, a healer and friend." The garden still blooms every spring, tended now by the current homeowners who learned its significance and vowed to maintain it. In 2013, on the 20th anniversary of Michelle's death, the Mobile Press-Register published a long-form retrospective on the case. The article, written by Derek Collins, the same journalist who'd interviewed Walter in jail, traced the timeline of the murder, the investigation, the trial, and the aftermath. Collins interviewed survivors, detectives, forensic experts, and Michelle's former colleagues. The article concluded with a reflection. Michelle Beets's murder was a tragedy that rippled through Mobile for decades. It exposed the dangers of workplace violence, the failures of early stalking laws, and the devastating consequences when threats aren't taken seriously. But it also demonstrated the power of thorough police work, community cooperation, and the courage of witnesses like Carla Gaines who chose to tell the truth despite personal cost. Walter Gaines is dead now, his name largely forgotten. But Michelle's name lives on in the award given in her honor, in the advocacy work her mother championed, in the safety laws that protect healthcare workers today. That's the legacy of her life, and it's a legacy that far outlasts the violence that ended it. The article was read by thousands, shared online, and used in criminal justice courses as a case study in homicide investigation and victim advocacy. In the Franklin Mountains of West Texas, where this story might have unfolded in a different telling, the wind blows across rocky terrain, carrying the scent of creosote and dust. But in Mobile, Alabama, the wind that April evening in 1993 carried the smell of magnolias and salt water, and it rustled through the wisteria vine where a killer hid in shadows, waiting. Michelle Beets walked up 7 wooden steps, keys in hand, thinking about dinner, about her fiancé arriving soon, about the wedding dress hanging in her closet. She had no way of knowing those 7 steps were the last she'd ever take. No way of knowing that anger and resentment had been watching her, planning, waiting for the precise moment when darkness would fall and mercy would vanish. Her story is one of thousands. A life cut short by violence, a family shattered by loss, a community forced to reckon with the reality that sometimes evil doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It hides in plain sight, in the face of a fired employee, in the scrawled pages of a notebook, in the deliberate severing of power lines on a humid Alabama evening. But Michelle's story is also one of resilience, of detectives who refused to let her case go unsolved, of a wife who chose truth over loyalty, of a community that transformed grief into action. The Michelle Beets Memorial Award continues to be given every year, and every year, a nurse walks onto a stage, accepts a plaque, and hears Michelle's story. They learn about her dedication, her compassion, her belief that healing was both a profession and a calling. And in that moment, Michelle Beets lives again. Not as a victim, but as a healer, a mentor, a reminder that some lights, once kindled, can never truly be extinguished. In Mobile, Alabama, where the Gulf breeze still carries the smell of magnolias, where Old Shell Road still winds through historic neighborhoods, where Providence Medical Center still serves thousands of patients, Michelle's legacy endures. Not in the violence that ended her life, but in the countless lives she touched before that terrible April evening, and in the lives that continue to be touched by her memory. Justice was served. Walter Gaines died in prison. But more importantly, Michelle Beets is remembered, not for how she died, but for how she lived. And in the end, that is the most powerful form of justice there is.